All right, lecture 5. This is the last lecture for the class, and here we're going to be talking about intercultural communication and how that's demonstrating everyday respect, expectations, and social awareness. And I very much think that this intercultural piece is the most interesting part of the class. So we're continuing in Module 3 here. And so this is where we're zooming in specifically on the cultural background, the intercultural backgrounds, and how that impacts our in-person and text-based communication. So another question for you. How do you know if somebody prefers a more formal greeting or wants you to be casual? So for sure, you've come across instances where you thought you were going to be formal and ended up actually being really relaxed, or the opposite. You thought something was casual, but actually it was really contained, constrained, formal. So most instances, it's safer to start out being formal, right? So you greet with like a handshake instead of a fist bump, but you can follow the other person's lead, right? So any sort of introduction, it's going to be a multi-person endeavor, right? Like you're probably not introducing yourself to yourself that often. And so you can follow the lead of the other person or the other people. And so if they stay formal, stay formal. If, they say, but you can call me blank, then that they're kind of setting that expectation that it's going to be a little bit more of a relaxed interaction. So you want to mirror what other people are giving you a lot of times. That's generally a safe way to go about all of this. And so if somebody introduces themselves as Dr. Blank, then you know probably that they are wanting to have a little bit more of a formal relationship. Different ways that we greet, right? Like the actual words that we use. Again, many words can say the same thing. So pay attention to what sort of language they're demonstrating. The nonverbal cues are always going to be coming up. And then also the context. Some contexts are going to be formal all the time. And so casual, it will be, the opposite of all of that. So more first names. Hey, yo, what's up? Sup, if you're a millennial. The nonverbals, again, that's going to be more of an open posture, smiling more readily, hugging and greeting, or doing the fist bump. And that's going to tend to be more with your friends, people that you know, and more social relationships. But it can vary as well. You can have very casual workplaces, for instance. And so the cultural pieces, these are noticeable in all of these everyday things that we've already talked about, right? So we talked about just kind of what you need to get through life in academic environments and professional environments. And so this is adding another layer to all of that. So you have to consider all of the formality or informality or expectations of the context for that, but then also for the individuals, right? Some people will expect formality across all circumstances because of the environment that they're raised in, or the opposite, right? I've lived in several countries outside of the US, and pretty much everywhere I've gone, it's been like, oh, she's American, she's relaxed. There are things that I would do that were appropriate for an American environment that seemed a little, she's really comfortable in other places. It made people kind of think, and had to think about the cultural backgrounds and norms that I was expecting or comfortable with. One thing in particular was in England, people wearing sweatpants out in public. At the time I was there, it's not as common as it is now. It was only a decade ago, but still, it was less common for people to wear sweatpants unless they were just like running out to take the trash out to the curb. So I would wear sweatpants all the time because it was very cold and it was more comfortable, and I was a student, and when you're a student you want to roll out of bed in your sweatpants, right? So it was something that people had to adjust for and understand that I wasn't unwell because I was wearing sweatpants. I was just comfortable. And so in daily life, there's way more than what I'm going to cover here, but there's a couple kind of big things that will help you understand, is it this way or that way based on cultural norms or expectations. And so we have high versus low context communication. High context cultures tend to be like more East Asia, and they rely very heavily on the implicit clues, right? So the things that aren't directly said, you kind of observe to the extreme to be able to understand the context that you're working in. And low context cultures are very direct. They will just tell you exactly what they want. So in the US, we tend to have more of a low context culture. Email communication is something that can be interpreted very differently depending on this high versus low culture. So somebody in the low culture context will send a one-line email that just says, "What's happening? When is it going to happen?" Because what they want to know is what's happening and when is it going to happen. So they're just telling you directly, this is the information I need from you. Where somebody from a high context culture will kind of be put off by that. It's going to seem abrupt to them, sudden. And so they will maybe ask that same thing in person. They will have maybe a little bit of a conversation before that. This is where, like, a lot of the "I hope this message finds you well" thing that a lot of people now will identify as a signifier of chat GPT usage, because it is overly formal for a low context culture. Then we also have individualism versus collectivism. And so this is basically, is the priority me as the individual, or is the priority the whole group finding peace and efficiency together? And so in public speaking, if you're in an individualistic culture, which the US would tend to be identified as individualistic, you're going to say, what did you do? How did you contribute to what you're talking about? And so I will be used very often. In a collectivist culture, it's going to be, what did we accomplish? So even if you are actually the one who did the work, you're still going to say we, because you're still part of a team. And the team is what matters. You want that social cohesion. And if you don't have the social cohesion, it means that it's a failure almost. So in instances where maybe it is just you doing the work, you're going to almost try to hide that, because it's better if it was we than if it was I. In individualistic culture, it's, okay, I did this, I was a successful one here, other people didn't contribute, didn't do their responsibility. And so, appreciate me for what I accomplished despite this. Then we have power distance. And so that's about how you accept and expect these different hierarchical structures. And so I've talked about them in terms of like supervisor, colleagues, somebody that you're supervising. And this will come across a lot in like how you're addressing people. So your supervisors, but also like professors. High power distance cultures, like the example of India, your employees are going to be addressing their boss using very formal titles. Sometimes it might even be seen from a US perspective as overly formal, very respectful. There's no questioning of the authority. It's okay, they're in the authority position, so they are correct always. So there's almost like for lack of a better word, like a submission in that sort of situation, where in low power distance cultures, so like Scandinavia, Denmark, it's going to be talking to people using their first name, much more collegial, on the same level, working for the same goal. And there's going to be more collaboration involved in making choices, making decisions. And so you don't have that big distance, you have a small distance. In some instances, it might seem like no distance at all. And we have time orientation. This is a really big one. And this is one where I would say, even within cultures, the time orientation will vary based on the life stage that you're in, right? So monochronic cultures will be places where time is exact. You must be punctual. Probably you have to be early to be punctual, right? And so it's this kind of social contract that if you've said you're going to be there at 2, you are there at 2. If you're not there at 2, you better have been hit by a car on the way, because you have no excuse, right? It's like disrespectful to people if you don't follow time exactly, linearly. Where polychronic cultures are going to be places where time is more of, an adaptive concept. Time is socially constructed. And so it's going to be more about being flexible, kind of just going with the flow and prioritizing the relationships that you're able to build. So if you're running late because you were having a really great conversation with somebody, that's okay, because you were doing something valuable and you were contributing to that kind of community aspect. So in a monochronic culture, we're starting exactly when we say we're going to start. In a polychronic culture, you kind of come in about around the time maybe, and it's all right if people are kind of like hopping into a Zoom call, 20 minutes after the hour when you were supposed to start. It doesn't matter. As long as you can still reach your goal eventually, everybody's good. And so, with all of these different cultural dimensions of life, they show that cross cultural communication requires you to be aware of all these different things in different environments. And so, you might never actually move, but more and more jobs are remote, right? So, you might enter a workplace where your colleagues are literally working all over the world. And so, you have to be aware of these things. Even though you haven't physically changed, the culture that you're interacting in might change. Maybe you're working with a firm that has another office in Calcutta. And so if they're leading the project, you adapt to what they expect, right? So it's being aware of these different pieces. There's way more, like I said, than what I mentioned here, but understanding how they will actually impact day to day life. So whether it's academic or workplace, there can be really big impacts based on each of these. And so, how do you navigate these expectations, right? Like, it's a lot to keep track of. It's a lot to keep track of. So, you want to follow the lead of somebody else. So, whoever you're interacting with, not necessarily defer to them, but kind of observe and then go forward in the same way. And so, if you're in doubt, again, it's best to always go with the formality and then loosen up. You want to pay attention to things like your email signatures. That's how people are often going to tell you how they want to be addressed. Understand things like face saving and politeness. I taught in England for a while, and most of my students were Chinese. And that's a very big power distance culture, right? But there's also this idea of face and not wanting to risk, being the laughing stock of the class. And so when my students were silent, it was from them showing me respect because I'm the authority in the classroom. And so I shouldn't be questioned. And coming from an American perspective, actually, I want to be challenged by my students. I want that kind of engagement that will come out of having different opinions. And so I had to understand where they were to understand that actually I wasn't in front of a class of students who weren't paying any attention to me. It was that they respected me. And so we could kind of go forward and build our classroom environment with that shared understanding. And then understand when silence is normal versus something that needs to be addressed, right? Sometimes silence is great. It means people are thinking. Other times it's something's been done wrong, right? Some expectation hasn't been met. So some ways that you might come across these different cultural expectations are when you have a professor from a different country, right? Or when you're in class with students from other countries. If you're on a group project with international students from 3 different countries, there's going to be lots of different demands and expectations that'll come into play. You're going to have diverse teams in workplaces, just interacting with the community, right? Like we have a world full of difference. And so you're not going to be able to avoid, and you shouldn't want to avoid having these cultural differences, but you want to kind of be aware of them and not afraid of them to be able to engage and kind of make the most of the experiences. So code switching across cultures, you want to ensure that you are adapting politely, but you also don't want it to be something that you're constantly thinking of, okay, is this appropriate here? Is this not appropriate here? So I'm maybe putting some fear into you by having all of these different cultural differences highlighted, but it's not meant to kind of scare you or like turn you into like a deer in headlights where you just freeze up because you're not sure what's correct. Generally, this communication is not malicious. So you should assume good intent from people just the same way that they should assume that from you. So if you do commit any faux pas, acknowledge it, apologize, ask how to go forward in the correct way. So you can expect that from others, but you should also give that grace to others. Being patient, sometimes it takes a lot of time to interpret these differences and the expectations. But also it's an opportunity, right? Like to learn about all these different cultures, these different places. Maybe you've not traveled there, but you can learn about it through communicating with people. And it's actually just really fun. That's why I think this is the best part of the class. But then we all come into any interaction with our own biases. And when it's cultures that are going to be more removed from us, so maybe not just like a different religion in your community, but actually somebody who literally lives on the other side of the world and speaks a different language, you're going to have different stereotypes, different things that are going to come in and kind of shape how you're interpreting situations. And so that's fine. You can't remove that. We're never going to be completely blank slates, but be aware of how those expectations or stereotypes are impacting how you're interacting, right? Own it, essentially, and then be willing to change it as you get more information. So, with your verbal communication, these are good practices across all contexts, not just when you're communicating with people from different cultures. So, you want to speak clearly, you want to speak simply. We don't need lots of fancy terminology. Um, most of the time ever, right? Like when I read a paper that has really big SAT words, is what we used to call them, multi-syllable words that are far fancier than are necessary. It seems like somebody went through and used a thesaurus and just changed random words. It doesn't feel natural. So we don't want that because it's going to kind of throw off the flow of communication, whether it's written or verbal. You want to be direct, again, ensuring that you are still maintaining that politeness. You want to listen always. You want to confirm understanding. So rephrase things. This is one of those instances where everybody smiling and nodding doesn't necessarily mean that they understand. It means that they're smiling and nodding. So you want to ask these follow-up questions to make sure that it does actually mean that they understand. And if not, then you can clarify. You can go forward from there. So, cultural dimensions impacting our daily communication. I've got a couple scenarios here that will kind of work you through some of those differences that I mentioned. So, scenario, we have a student from an individualistic culture giving direct credit to their own accomplishments during a group presentation. And so, this is probably something you're familiar with, right? Like, I think all of us have been in a group where we are the one who did most of the work, or at least we feel like we did most of the work. Also, sometimes you just say, I did this, I'm responsible for this. So it's not even saying that I took, credit for this being done, just this is what I've done. But so somebody from a collectivist culture is going to perceive this as being boastful. So it's not necessarily earned credit you're trying to claim, right? That's how they'll perceive it. And so, we have this self-promotion versus group success imbalance, or the competition between the two. And we have in a hallway, a low context communicator says, I need your part of the project by noon. So they're stating the demand in a casual kind of space, right? So a high context communicator might expect this to be a little bit more delicate. So there's first maybe the awkwardness of it being done in a public space in a hallway. Maybe they feel like that's not appropriate because it's like letting people around believe they haven't done something that they were supposed to do. Maybe noon today was an agreed upon deadline and we haven't passed noon yet, so nobody's done anything wrong, but it's not going to come across that way. It's going to seem like you didn't submit by the deadline, so I need it immediately now. So a high context communicator basically would just expect it to be a little softer. They would maybe expect it to be in a different format. Maybe something like this could come through email instead of being in person, or at least in public. In group work, a student from a high uncertainty avoidance culture requests a detailed plan with deadlines, templates, and a shared folder. So uncertainty avoidance is another thing that I haven't actually talked about before, but I believe that you would be able to figure that out, right? So uncertainty avoidance, avoiding uncertainty. They want things to be clear. And so this is demonstrated here with their request for the deadlines and the template. So a low certainty, uncertainty avoidance classmate would actually be stressed out by that. Somebody who doesn't like that sort of degree of planning or organization, it would feel almost like this is creating boundaries that they don't want to fit within, or expectations that they might not be able to meet. They want to be able to be more flexible and kind of work as inspiration hits. This, for me, has connections back into something like ADHD, right? So you might be creating unnecessary stress on somebody because of your preferences. So understanding that you can still be effective, but you don't necessarily need to have that level of structure. Or if you need it for yourself, maybe you don't impose it on others, right? You want to have that communication to see, is this going to be a useful tool, or is it going to be something that creates new problems? So essentially, from this, intercultural communication requires that you are constantly aware, you're taking stock of your surroundings, you're paying attention to the different cultures, and you're respecting those differences. And when you're respecting those differences, you're demonstrating that by adapting to them. So even if you're still within your culture, if you're working with people from another, you can be the one to adapt, right? And when you do that, you're building that rapport that will also make other people want to adapt to fit your expectations or your norms. So we're building that two-way communication street. And so there's a lot of variability for all of this. And it's going to change too. Like these cultures are not static. They don't stay the same forever. When we've had more technology come in, we have greater interaction across cultures. And so that has created new norms. It's made it maybe easier to have these cross-cultural interactions because we're more aware of other people's cultures than we might have been at times in the past. Essentially, it's fun. There's a lot of difference. It can be really fun, I should say. It can also be really stressful and really challenging. And so if you come into it with the right mindset of the opportunity and the observation to lead to success, it can be great. So that's our last lecture. We've seen things in different academic and workplace contexts. We've seen different cultural impacts and pressures, expectations, and norms. And now you get to put it all together in your final project.